In 2013, the Retail Distribution Review changed the way in which financial advisors were remunerated for the services they provide to consumers. The intent of the RDR was to remove bias from the value chain and to increase competitive pressure applying to firms in the market. However, an unintended consequence of RDR is something that we now all call or refer to as being the advice gap. In 2015, the Financial Advice Market Review explored ways of closing that advice gap, and early in 2016, 28 ideas were put forward for closing the advice gap. Research subsequently conducted by the Social Market Foundation found that in 2017, 76% of consumers still wanted a personal recommendation from an expert, but they weren't able to or didn't want to pay for financial advice. That means that 3/4 of consumers in the UK are unable to get the sort of service from the financial advice market that they want. The FCA are currently conducting a post-implementation review of FAMR and the RDR. We expect to hear more from the FCA in 2020, and over the course of this short video, we're going to explore 3 ideas or 3 themes for closing the gap in the advice market. The first approach to closing the advice gap is something that we call Guidance Plus. Under Guidance Plus, the industry and regulators continue to work together to explore innovative ways of getting the answers which are on the tip of the tongue of experts over to the consumer, but in a way that doesn't tip that dialogue technically into advice. But Guidance Plus is also about confidence, finding ways to give firms the confidence to get as close to the advice boundary as possible without tipping over into advice, and therefore maximising the value add for the maximum number of consumers. The second approach to closing the advice gap is something that we call Advice Minus. We might also call it Advice Light. At the moment, we measure the value of advice against a perfect outcome and applying hindsight. That's a very high bar, and therefore the cost of advice comes at a commensurately high cost. There are 3 drivers to the cost of advice. The first is the breadth and depth of the advisor's assessment of a client's needs and a client's wants. The second is the level of expertise, and therefore the expense of the advisors providing that advice. And the third is an indemnity insurance that needs to be put in place to protect advisors from potential future claims for compensation from their clients. If we wanted to provide a much cheaper alternative to advice, something we might call Advice Light, the way that could look would be it might look only to address more specific needs. It may be provided by less experienced and less costly individuals. The consumer value would be in the form of protecting consumers from significant pitfalls, aiming to provide good or better outcomes for consumers, but not guaranteeing to deliver the optimal outcome, and by removing the recourse for the consumer to seek compensation in the future. Financial advisors that I have spoken to have told me that an advice light style of proposition could help tackle another advice gap. That other advice gap is in the form of the number of qualified financial advisors in the UK, with that number projected to shrink over the next 5 to 10 years as older financial advisors retire and with an insufficient flow of new blood coming into that sector. Few advisor firms have the financial resources to train new recruits to the fully qualified level, but this advice light style of proposition, which they believe they could provide to the public for between £50 and £100, would allow those firms to generate revenue to cover the cost of those trainees on their journey through to becoming fully qualified. The third potential approach to closing the advice gap is to tackle the gap from the demand side. The Financial Advice Market Review put forward 28 recommendations to help close the advice gap, but they tended to focus on the supply side, focusing on areas such as education, guidance, and advice. Whilst consumers with significant financial decisions will undoubtedly benefit from good quality advice, we shouldn't have a system that is so complicated that it forces consumers to pay experts simply to explain that system to them. By focusing on simplifying the product landscape and by focusing on simplifying areas such as tax rules, we could reduce the size of the advice gap from the demand side.